You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 30th of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Nina Dos Santos. On today's programme...
I'm Andrew Muller. I'll be joining from Odessa as Ukraine's great port city welcomes guests to the second annual Black Sea Forum.
More from Andrew in Ukraine in just a moment's time. Then...
S'il n'y a pas une réponse qui est à la hauteur de la situation humanitaire qui est apportée dans les prochaines heures et les prochains jours, bien évidemment qu'il faudra durcir la position collective et appliquer des sanctions.
President Macron warns of punitive measures for Israel if the aid situation doesn't improve. Also ahead, Trump's rollercoaster week in tariffs and how two architects have managed to breathe new life into a former convent in lovely Lisbon. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Nina Dos Santos. Peace talks aimed at bringing the Ukraine war to an end will resume next week in Istanbul. This after the last round ended on a sour note, with Russia facing accusations of sending a low-level delegation and stalling for time over the negotiating table in an effort to make gains on the battlefield instead. Kyiv was hit by the biggest missile and drone strikes so far since the invasion began in February 2022. Well, that in turn has prompted more frustration from the United States, which is now threatening to give up on brokering a deal between Russia and Ukraine, after all, if the 30-day ceasefire isn't forthcoming soon. I'm joined now by Monocle's contributing editor and host of the Foreign Desk, Andrew Muller, who is in Odessa this week, where the Black Sea Security Forum is currently taking place. Andrew, let's start with the idea that this is an event that could well survive the Ukraine war when, eventually, hopefully, peace is brought to the country. And in fact, it's happening in an important building, the Opera House, that showcases Odessa's famous place in the world.
These conferences often tend to happen in fairly drab and functional arenas. You cannot fault the choice of location on this one. No, I mean, if people haven't seen pictures of the Odessa Opera House, I encourage them to look a few up. It is, even by Odessa's lofty standards, an absolutely stunning building. And I think, yes, that's part of the statement that they're making, that, you know, this is the sort of thing that should happen in a city like Odessa, and in normal times would happen in a city like Odessa, and it wouldn't be a thing. But yeah, again, I think there's a sense among Ukrainians that for all the worst reasons, they've had vastly more attention paid to them in the last 3 years than they had in the 30-odd years since independence beforehand. And they're starting to think that, you know, out the other side of this, we will be a major power, we will be a major country. And it will be the kind of place that hosts great events like this.
And presumably significant business people, like, for instance, Lord Ashcroft, who's a big donor of the British Conservative Party, throwing their weight behind that argument. Who is attending? Presumably lots of British MPs, if you've got somebody like Lord Ashcroft sponsoring this event?
There's a decent-sized contingent of British MPs. There's a lot of Ukrainian MPs, obviously. I have heard from various organisers, and it's a depressing statement about the current state of things, that they had no luck at all getting representatives of the US government to come. There's a lot of NGOs. There's a few ambassadors who serve in Kiev. I'm hoping to speak to Canada's ambassador to Ukraine later today. And perhaps curiously, there's quite a large Australian contingent. I mean, I know we get everywhere, but I was surprised just being up at the venue this morning how many there were, two of whom are former Prime Ministers, Scott Morrison and Tony Abbott.
Well, things have changed quite a bit in terms of the security dynamic in Ukraine, in terms of support, particularly from Europe. Over the last week or so, we've had Western powers like, for instance, the UK signalling that they're fine with Ukraine being allowed to use its weaponry deeper into Russian territory. Also, more supportive measures coming from Germany as well. How are those dynamics playing out in Odessa, where you are?
There's a lot of anxiety, obviously. I mean, I think there's been a lot of anxiety in Ukraine for 3 years, arguably 11 years at this point. And a lot of it, but right now, over the last few months, is attached to which way the United States is going to jump, if indeed the United States is going to jump in any direction in particular, or just continue jumping up and down. I did speak earlier to Michael Hewitt, a former US Navy Rear Admiral, who does seem kind of optimistic about the fact that not only that there is a conscious element to Trump's policy, but that it is actually working, that it has woken the Europeans up, and it has demonstrated to them that they can and should behave like a superpower. I think the announcement from Germany yesterday, it's not quite everything that President Zelensky wanted, in that the Germans have not said, at least not publicly, we will shortly find out if they might have said it privately, that Ukraine can deploy the Taurus long-range missile against Russian targets. But when Chancellor Merz was talking about investing in the future of Ukraine's defense industry, that is something that a lot of people are really taking seriously. The idea that out the other side of this, even once the war is over, Ukraine is going to be Europe's arsenal. This is, it is at the absolute cutting edge now of defense technology, especially drone technology, not just airborne drones, but naval drones as well. I mean, as the American Rear Admiral I mentioned pointed out, they are a country which has in the last few years effectively won a naval battle without actually having a navy.
How has the Ukraine minerals deal gone down over there?
There's still an amount of uncertainty about how that will work. I think people that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to a couple of current and former Ukrainian officials just chatting about this, they like the idea of a mutually dependent economic relationship with the United States, and it's easy to see what the logic of that is, that if the US has substantial amounts invested here, then the US is more likely to be willing to protect Ukraine. But there's the inevitable concern about how reliable is any deal struck with the United States at the moment, given that nobody is entirely sure what the US president is going to think about any given thing when he wakes up in the morning.
Well, we have had signals from the United States, even just again in the last 24 hours, hinting that they're getting increasingly frustrated with Vladimir Putin's lack of engagement on this proposal of a 30-day ceasefire, and that America could just shrug its shoulders and back out of brokering these peace talks. How do people in Ukraine feel when they see the White House repeatedly sending that signal?
Again, I think they're trying to be optimistic, because I think people in circumstances like these have to be optimistic. You have to think that there is a way through this. You have to think that victory is achievable, and you have to think that peace will return, because otherwise, why continue? But I think they're just extremely nervous about the United States. They are reassured by the degree to which Europe seems to have apprehended that they have to step up here and that there is catching up to do. But everybody understands that the United States is the United States. And I spoke earlier to the Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik about exactly this. And she said so much, well, pretty much everything is going to depend on what kind of security guarantees Ukraine can be offered that will underpin any ceasefire or any peace. And I don't think anybody is yet confident that a security guarantee that does not have the United States behind it somewhere is going to be worth all that much.
And just finally, with the United States obviously making it very clear that the US administration at the moment does not view favourably President Zelensky, has his popularity in Ukraine started to wane quite significantly in the wake of that minerals deal and obviously the fracas we saw in the Oval Office a few months ago?
This conversation has come up as well. The fracas in the Oval Office actually considerably revived his standing within Ukraine, is the impression that I get from people. There is inevitably, after 3 years, there is an amount of fracturing. Sort of domestic politics, as usual, has returned a little bit. There are people who are critical of President Zelensky, but even one other opposition MP I was talking to yesterday acknowledged that his, by internal polling in Ukraine, he's not at the sort of 95% he was at in February 2022, but most polling still puts him in the high 70s. And I think you ask any other European head of government or head of state whether they'd trade for that right now, they'd take it.
Thanks, Andrew. That was Andrew Muller. Now, here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Nina. Trade talks between Washington and Beijing are a bit stalled, according to the U.S. Treasury Secretary. His comment comes less than 3 weeks after a temporary trade truce was agreed between the world's two largest economies, with both agreeing to reduce tit-for-tat tariffs. The Swiss government has authorized the sale of 71 Leopard 1 tanks to Germany under the condition that neither the tanks nor any parts are sent to Ukraine. The Swiss government had previously refused to authorize the sale due to concerns that the tanks could be transferred to Kyiv. That's because, according to Swiss law, arms sales to countries at war are prohibited. And smoking will be banned in most public places in France from the 1st of July. The French health minister announced the ban will cover parks, public greens, beaches, bus shelters, sports facilities, and around schools. Failure to comply with the ban may result in a fine of €135. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Nina.
Thanks, Laura. French President Emmanuel Macron is wrapping up his tour of Asia this week with a major speech that he's just delivered at the region's largest defence summit taking place in Singapore. Well, the event, called the Shangri-La Dialogue, will also see big interventions being made by Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary. But China has instead snubbed the gathering amid growing tensions in terms of trade, Taiwan and, of course, Beijing's growing footprint in the South China Sea that has left some of its neighbours pretty uncomfortable these days. I'm joined now by the Singapore-based journalist Adam Hancock to run through some of these issues. Adam, let's start out with Emmanuel Macron's comments on Israel. Why did he choose an Asian forum to make them, especially after the sort of coordinated approach that we saw with Canada and the UK rebuking Israel a week or so ago in a letter? Instead, he's gone it alone. Will it make a difference?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the timing of this. It comes as he's about to make a very big, notable speech here at the Shangri-La Summit. It's the Friday night speech. It's the big keynote event of the weekend. And he's the first European leader ever to have that slot at the summit, which has been going now for over 20 years. So it is a significant speech in front of an audience of defence officials. And it's interesting that today he has made these comments about France hardening their position. I think he knows that right now he has a very big platform. He's on a tour of Southeast Asia by himself. He's got this big speech tonight. He's put this statement out ahead of this speech. It was made alongside the Singapore Prime Minister earlier today. He did actually make slightly similar comments a few days ago when he was in Indonesia. He put out a joint statement with the Indonesian President, Prabowo Subianto. And again, they were condemning Israeli plans to seize control of Gaza and expel the population. So it's not something that he's not said before, but it's interesting that he's chose to do it today here in Singapore. I think he knows the attention is on him right now. I think he knows that he has a captive audience, and any comments that he makes about the situation in Gaza will be picked up on today. He's got the US Defence Secretary here, top-ranking officials from around the world. So this is almost a perfect platform for him, really.
I'll come to the US Defence Secretary in just a second time, but just to stay with the topic of Macron, he's obviously, as you said, embarked upon this big tour at a key moment when the relationship between the United States and some of these Southeast Asian countries is becoming increasingly tense thanks to the backdrop of high reciprocal tariffs announced by the White House. And Macron has pitched himself as the reliable partner for Asian countries. How has that message gone down? Do they believe him?
I think it's accepted here, in all honesty. I think people do believe him. I think they appreciate him coming out to this region, visiting Vietnam, visiting Indonesia and Singapore as well. I think countries in this region, like they are in Europe, they're hesitant about how much support they're going to get from the Trump administration. They're looking around for other allies, and Europe definitely can provide a solution. And I think Macron has such a standing in this part of the world in terms of he's just seen as a statesman and a representative for all of Europe. So I think those words coming from him, they will be listened to here. A lot of countries in this region, Indonesia, for example, they do have very good relations with France. He was able to sign a lot of deals, get a lot of agreements in place. Even today in Singapore, he's been doing the same. He went out to a local hawker centre last night with the Singaporean Prime Minister. It was obviously a bit of a photo opportunity, but a huge crowd were down there. He's quite popular in this part of the world. I think he's very recognisable. People who are aware who he is, and they respect him as well. So it's probably a slightly different impression of Macron in Europe than it is in this part of the world. But I think people would take his word for that Europe and France are behind this region.
Well, let's move on to the United States, that is developing a more tense economic relationship with some of these countries. Pete Hegseth, as you pointed out, the US Defense Secretary, is making his first speech at this particular event. To what extent are we expecting him to outline the Trump administration's approach to the region at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the key message throughout the speech. It's his first opportunity to put that across to countries in this region. It's one of the keynote slots on a Saturday morning. It's always the US Defense Secretary gets the chance to speak first. And I think a lot of countries in this region now, as you mentioned, they've been hit by tariffs from a country that they thought was an ally, and now they're looking for reassurance that the US still considers this an important region. It would still be there for them if the worst was to happen. So they're going to be watching this speech very closely. Everyone knows that Pete Hegseth is a bit of a character. It's been an eventful start to his time as Defense Secretary, I think it's fair to say. So there's plenty of anticipation, arguably more anticipation for that speech tomorrow than there is for Emmanuel Macron's speech tonight. But yeah, I think given the situation with China, the tensions that are rising, and the fact that if there was to be any form of conflict between those two superpowers, it would likely be this part of the world. Like countries that are closely aligned with the US, they want reassurances from the US Defense Secretary that Washington is behind them.
And is the subject of Taiwan going to come up and actually be named, or do you think that he'll just talk around the contours of US support for Taiwan if China were to eventually make a play for the island?
Yeah, generally they kind of dance around the issue somewhat. There's always lots of kind of sweeping statements about Indo-Pacific security and regional issues, and they tend not to go into too much detail about specific issues. He may well mention it. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. It will definitely be a topic of discussion this weekend amongst defence officials here. It's obviously, when you talk about security in this part of the world, the issue of Taiwan is right at the top of that list. So it will be interesting to see if he does directly discuss it and what the position will be. Obviously, always so much speculation about Taiwan. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if he mentioned it, but don't expect him to as well.
So China, of course, is not sending its defence minister. What does that signal?
Yeah, it's raised a lot of eyebrows here this year. I think it's the first time since 2019 that China hasn't sent their defense minister. They haven't given a reason, so it's opened the void to plenty of speculation about just exactly why this is. The general consensus seems to be that, considering it's quite tense at the moment between China and the United States, at times when it has been politically quite sensitive, they've opted against sending a defense minister to this meeting, and it looks like they're doing the same thing again. It can also be quite difficult for Chinese defense ministers here. They face open questions sometimes. They can face difficult questions. A lot of countries want to speak to China about the South China Sea and their position on that. So it can be an awkward few days for Chinese defense officials. They've sent a very low-ranked delegation, but I was speaking to an analyst earlier who was saying that they won't be afraid to speak up. They may even challenge some of the speeches that take place from the floor. So it will certainly be interesting to see what the delegation does. But yeah, it's quite interesting that the Chinese defense minister won't be here, because this is one of the very rare opportunities when they can have face-to-face talks with their US counterpart.
Adam Hancock in Singapore, thank you very much for those insights. You're listening to The Briefing here on Monocle Radio. An appeals court in the United States has temporarily reinstated President Donald Trump's tariffs on the country's trading partners worldwide after a panel of federal judges on Wednesday deemed the so-called Liberation Day measures illegal. The president's lawyers say that if the judge's ruling is not completely overturned, well, they will then ask the Supreme Court to intervene. The three judges sitting on the federal government's International Trade Court said that President Trump did not have the authority to use an emergency law dating back to 1977 as the legal justification for his tariff regime. Our Washington correspondent Simon Marks reports.
The White House was incandescent over the judge's ruling, a vehement response rooted in the fact that it threatens completely to upend the central pillar of President Trump's economic policies. He views tariffs not just as the key plank of his global trade war, but also a vital national security tool that he uses to try and urge the country's allies, partners and competitors to bend to his will. He has also promised the American people that tariff revenues will raise so much money for the US Treasury that eventually it may even be possible to scrap income tax and fund the entire government out of tariff revenues alone. Which is one reason why, on April the 2nd in the White House Rose Garden, he made a very big deal of his reciprocal tariff announcement.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time.
The president insisted a new golden age was dawning as he announced tariff levels that he was unilaterally imposing against virtually every single country around the world.
Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. Oh, look at Cambodia, 97%. We're going to bring it down to 49. They made a fortune with the United States of America. United Kingdom, 10%, and we'll go 10%. So we'll do the same thing.
Fast forward 2 months and his strategy is suddenly threatened after the International Trade Court ruled that only Congress could impose or regulate tariffs and that the president could not use a 1977 emergency law as an end run around the legislature.
The courts should have no role here.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
There is a troubling and dangerous trend of unelected judges inserting themselves into the presidential decision-making process. America cannot function if President Trump, or any other president for that matter, has their sensitive diplomatic or trade negotiations railroaded by activist judges.
Late on Thursday, an appeals court reinstated his tariffs temporarily while they consider the White House appeal against the initial ruling. But the legal drama is threatening to upend ongoing negotiations with the EU, China and more than 90 other countries. So the White House is determined that if necessary, the Supreme Court will either ride to the president's rescue or he will find other legislative instruments to continue waging his trade war. I'm Simon Marks for Monocle Radio.
Thank you, Simon. You're with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This week, the Portuguese capital is busy with Arco Contemporary Art Fair and also the Lisbon Design Week. One of the participants in this year's event is AB plus AC Architects, and they've been showcasing an installation at a new design hotel, which is called Loc de Santa Joana, which used to actually be an old convent. Monocle's Maylie Evans caught up with AB plus AC, the co-founders, in particular Andre Shadid and Ariana Bavuzzo. Andre began by explaining their inspiration for the final pieces of the Alma Mater installation.
The final pieces were actually designed before knowing where we'd be exhibiting exactly. But when we visited the site and they said, this is the location that you'll be exhibiting, we found it extremely fitting. One, because they are candle holders and this is a convent. Two, because these sculptures and our practice is heavily based on spaces that heal. So usually, because our focus is architecture and interiors, it's about spaces. This is our first endeavor into the collectible design world. So these are actually objects for mindfulness and for healing practices and spaces of healing.
And I wondered if you could talk to me a bit more about this idea of the practice being centered around mindfulness and healing, because that feels like quite an unusual sort of standpoint or sort of something you're putting front and center. Why is that so key for you, or why is it something that you wish more people were thinking about or sort of concerned with in day-to-day life?
When we started to practice around 4 years ago, we came from kind of like a personal journey and experience. For instance, in my case, living prior to COVID in China, in Beijing, in a city with where you have a lack of clean air and good oxygen, let's say. And prior to that, I was living in Copenhagen, for example, a city that, despite I love and is beautiful, it has a lack of sunlight. And just these two tiny personal anecdotes and experiences make us then reflect, fast forward in the years when we open our practice in what's the intentionality that we want to give to the projects we do, what's our mission. And immediately it fell into well-being, this idea that the spaces that we design or objects or installations, because we also do a lot of immersive installation, they shape us consciously or not. And exactly because of the reason, I then started to study neuroscience, and we went on developing a whole teaching program at the Great Nova campus in neuroarchitecture and psychology of spaces, in order to train also other architects on how can we use our tools, designing tools, but in a way that we can leverage positive, uplifting emotions. So emotion become a tool in a way, as if it was a floor plan or lighting or materials or colors.
The pieces that we have here today, as Eliana was saying, are made from steel that is powder coated to give this kind of dark brown effect. And the candles that are placed are also custom designed by us to fit in these cross-like shapes. The candles are made from beeswax from a producer here in Portugal, in Fatima, that is a very old factory that produces around 10,000 candles a day, all by hand. So it's all, assisted machinery, but all done by hand. A bit of the inspiration of these sculptures was this contrast between the man-made and the natural, the steel and the beeswax, coming together and forming this kind of synergy, yes, between what is man-made and what is natural. And the idea is that because the candles, as you see, melt, with time they become part of the sculpture. So this is also another thing we wanted to focus on, which is how time affects the piece itself. And with time, the wax will become part of the actual sculpture.
This collectible design collection for mindfulness is titled Alma Mater, and we chose this name because in Latin it means nourishing mother, and it really took inspiration from this primordial relationship that exists between the sun as a giver of energy and earth that gets fed through energy and produces nutrient. So the whole idea of the structure and of the beeswax candle was to create this kind of dichotomy between the structure that resembles in a way these sun rays crystallized into blackened iron, which is cold and masculine and rough, and then the nutrient, which is the pollen produced by the bees, so the beeswax candles, it gets inserted into the structure, and that's definitely more mellow and soft and perhaps feminine in a way, so it's like this yin and yang, and hopefully these pieces, once they will find a home, because they are meant to find a home, obviously, they will, really become a conduit of energy, matter, and human experience, for meditation and introspection.
We've got listeners who are, based all over the world. I wondered if just there was something that is something very small that someone listening can take with them, listening to you both talk about your approach to architecture, in terms of just one change that they could make, or something, a question they can ask themselves about the spaces they live or work in, that you think is really important to consider and to be evaluating or thinking about.
We like to say the spaces we live today will define who will become tomorrow. And so in that respect, what I would advise, for example, to listeners right now is to take a picture of the spaces you are right now. And then with a little bit of distance, maybe look again at that picture in a few days, maybe when you are on a walk in the park or in a random setup, and try to do the exercise of looking at it and thinking if I didn't know who was living in this space, who would this person be? Would I be proud of it? Would I feel that this person is interesting? Would I want to become their friend? Is it a healthy person? Is it like a sloppy or lazy person? You know, like is a successful person? You know, is it positive, uplifting, or is it an energy drainer person? And then based on that, in a way, like your environment can become your map in order to set the clues for the person you want to become.
That was Ariana Barroso and also André Chedid in conversation with Monocle's Maylee Evans. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Francesca Gilks, and also our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Nina Dos Santos. Goodbye, and also thanks for listening.